It was 1943 when a B-17 bomber limped back to England with a wing shredded, hydraulics bled dry, and instruments flickering. By every rule of physics, it should have plunged into the channel. The crew braced for fire. The runway readied for wreckage. Instead, a ghost of an airplane screamed down the tarmac, metal shrieking, sparks flying, and 8 men crawled out, bruised and alive. How does a plane with no brakes, no flaps, and a torn wing manage to land? This is the story of that impossible flight, and the unassuming mechanic who broke the rules to bring men home. December 20th, 1943. The B-17 Lucky Strike screams toward RAF Bassingbourn, a specter of ruin cutting across an iron-gray English sky. Its No. 3 engine is nothing but a ragged hole, metal peeled back, wires and fuel lines flapping, torn clean off by flak somewhere over Germany. The bomber shudders on the slipstream, instruments bouncing, wind howling through the breach. Men inside feel every gut-wrenching yaw and think of runways and home, but mostly they feel the aircraft fighting for breath. It looks like a ghost, barely holding itself together as it fights the last miles to the field. Red hydraulic fluid streaks its fuselage like blood, a crimson warning painted across aluminum. The gauges sit flat at 0. No pressure, no mercy. By the book, this plane is a dead man walking. Landing gear won't come down, flaps won't bite the air, brakes are nothing but dead levers. Without hydraulics, you lose more than parts. You lose the safety nets pilots rely on to tame a lumbering bomber on approach. The crew stares at that ugly truth and knows what it means. Whatever happens next will be improvisation under fire, a forced gamble to get this wrecked fortress back on the ground. Marcus Webb fights the controls like a man pulling a stubborn mule, wrists raw, jaw clenched, eyes locked on a shrinking runway. The B-17 is a crippled giant. With no hydraulics and a missing wheel, he isn't landing so much as improvising a controlled crash. One wheel, a feathered touch, everything else praying to hold together long enough. Behind him, the crew braces, waiting for metal to protest. The bomber slams down onto the tarmac, metal shrieking on asphalt, a blinding shower of sparks that lights up the night. It skids hard, yawing sideways as a wing bites into the ground and rips up black earth. The tail end slews, then everything jerks to a violent halt. Instruments die, engines cough, and for a heartbeat the air is full of smoke and carved metal. Crash crews sprint toward the wreckage, extinguishers up, faces hard, braced for a fireball and torn bodies. What they find instead is an almost impossible quiet. Bent metal and sparking wiring, sure, but no roaring blaze, no inferno swallowing the fuselage. Steam hisses. Men exchange stunned, suspicious looks, fingers still on handles, as if a single spark might change everything. For a long, heavy beat, nobody moves to pry open the carcass. Then, against that stunned silence, a hatch creaks. The hatch groans and then gives, a thin, reluctant sound that somehow feels like a promise. One by one, 8 figures haul themselves out, faces smeared with soot, hands bandaged, eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from cheating death. They're bruised, breathless, half-dazed, but they're alive. Ground crews stare as if watching a trick, extinguishers lower at their sides. Around them the bomber is a torn thing, hydraulics gone, systems fried, a wing like shredded cloth, yet it sat down without burning, and men walked away. For a long, stunned beat, no one speaks. The obvious question hangs in the cold air. How? Colonel Albertson steps out of his staff car, and the chaos hushes like someone flicked a switch. Men stand frozen, soot and red hydraulic streaks still drying on their uniforms. And the bomber sits there like a bad joke, wings shredded, systems dead, yet somehow whole. He walks the length of the wreck, runs a gloved hand along torn metal, and his face goes flat. No technical report, no heroic explanation. He turns to the nearest crew and in a voice that carries like a verdict, asks the only question that matters: how? The question hangs over the tarmac, an accusation and a promise, and the answer is not out here with the plane. The official inquiry would churn for months, pages of reports, diagrams, polite bureaucratic finger-pointing that tried to turn catastrophe into neat explanations. Experts would argue valves and vulnerability. Admirals and engineers would draft memos, but none of that dust could touch the simple, greasy truth waiting in a nearby hangar. A man with oil under his nails, sleeves rolled, listening to the sounds a wounded engine made, and knowing how to fix what the blueprints had failed to foresee. He wasn't at a desk. He was elbow deep in the guts of another bomber, and what he was doing there would change everything. His name was Staff Sergeant Paul Zuk, not a pilot, not an officer, a mechanic who lived by one rule: keep the planes alive. He worked in a dim hangar, elbows greased and hands stained with oil, bent over the guts of another engine. And what he was doing there would have gotten him court-martialed. He wasn't tinkering for glory. He was rewriting survival, rerouting lines, jury-rigging bypasses, and scavenging valves from wrecks, all outside the manuals and well outside official permission. To the brass, he was a dangerous rule-breaker. To the men who climbed out of mangled bombers, he was the reason they walked away. Behind the shiny legend of the Flying Fortress, there was a darker truth. B-17s were literally coming apart from damage that, on paper, should have been survivable. Planes with torn wings or punctured fuselages would suddenly drop out of formations, not from combat skill, but from quiet, catastrophic failures. Hydraulics that bled out, fuel lines routed like exposed nerves, single-hit weak points that turned a skirmish into a funeral. Higher-ups in Seattle and Washington shrugged or stayed silent. Reports were buried, hopes filed under operational losses. On the ground, men who flew and fixed these birds watched mates not return. Crews were paying the price in blood. One unlucky piece of flak, one severed line, and a perfectly serviceable B-17 didn't limp home. It died in the sky. A single hit to an exposed hydraulic or fuel run could steal a crew's landing gear, their flaps, their brakes, or the fuel feeding an engine, and there was nothing in the manual to save them. Boeing and the Pentagon kept quiet, locked in paperwork and models, while crews learned the brutal arithmetic the hard way. Design assumptions meant lives could be lost to a single puncture. The cost was measured in shattered planes and, worse, in blood. Lucky Strike's survival wasn't luck. It was proof that one man had found the plane's hidden flaw and quietly fixed it. Not a miracle, not divine intervention, but a grease-stained, jury-rigged solution that turned what should have been a fatal, textbook failure into a one-wheel landing and 8 men walking away. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because waiting for parts or paperwork meant bodies. That secret repair exposed a truth the brass and the manufacturers preferred to ignore. The fortress could be made to survive the worst, and the person who made that happen was already elbow-deep in another engine. We meet Paul Zuk properly. Not a polished engineer with a university degree, but a kid who learned to fix things in a Depression-era Pittsburgh garage where the rule was simple: make it work, no matter what. Oil lives under his nails. He doesn't consult manuals. He listens to metal and reads the language of broken parts. Where designers drew neat lines on paper, Zuk saw battlefield problems and jury-rigged solutions that kept men alive. He thinks in redundancies and workarounds, in valves you can reach with gloved hands, in fixes that are ugly and brilliant all at once. When he gets to Bassingbourn, that instinct will both save lives and stir trouble. When Paul Zuk stepped onto the cold tarmac at Bassingbourn, he stuck out like a wrench in a suit. No rank to flaunt, no manuals to wave, just a mechanic's eyes that read metal the way others read maps. His superiors saw checklists and schematics. He saw weak seams, exposed lines, and the single sliver of flak that would turn a flying fortress into a coffin. Garage-born and stubborn, he traced runs of tubing with a finger as if feeling for a pulse, already imagining where a simple fix could buy a crew another hour, another chance to get home. They shoved him under the nose of a grounded B-17 and pointed at a hairline fracture in the main hydraulic run, a single cracked line that meant no gear, no flaps, no brakes. The log said, parts, weeks. The crew chief said, stand down, wait for supply. Zuk looked at the bleeding hose, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and heard the old Pittsburgh rule in his head, make it work. Zuk stares at the immobilized bomber, tracing the maze of tubes and wires until a solution snaps into focus. He steps closer, calm and quick, and says, let me reroute it. He's proposing a bypass that isn't in any manual, crude, clever, and illegal. The crew chief says parts are weeks away. Zuk can't wait. His idea is forbidden. It violates procedure. But with the crew chief looking the other way, Zuk slips into the belly of the bomber and fashions a crude backup loop from salvaged hose and a valve, ties it into the main line, and tests it on a prayer. The gauges jump. The controls bite. The plane, declared unflyable, coughs, steadies, and rolls under power. Imperfect, nervous, but flyable. It changes everything. That first fix did more than make a plane fly. It cracked his view of the whole machine wide open. Once the bypass held under real stress, Zuk started seeing patterns. The same exposed hoses, the same vulnerable runs, the same tiny failure points that turned survivable damage into a death sentence. The telemetry and torn-up airframes told the same brutal story. These systems were chained together like a cheap string of Christmas lights. One hit, and everything went dark. It stopped being a one-off repair for him. It became a mission. Find the weak links and stop whole crews from falling with them. As he pored over wreckage and reports, a pattern snapped into focus. One vulnerable artery, exposed and unforgiving. The main hydraulic line ran naked along the bomb bay, exactly where flak and shrapnel like to find purchase. Hit that vein and the plane didn't just limp, it died. Landing gear, flaps, brakes, everything that turned a bomber into something you could put down went with it. One lucky shot, one severed line, and a perfectly good fortress became a falling coffin. It was a mechanical assassination, simple and brutal, and once Zuk saw it, he knew why so many crews never came home. But the hydraulics were only the start. Paul crawled deeper into the B-17's belly and found a second, quieter killer, the fuel plumbing. Tanks and lines had been routed so that one lucky piece of shrapnel could punch a hole and set off a cascade. Pressure bled off, pumps cavitated, one engine choked, then another. A domino failure that could leave 4 screaming, weightless engines and a plane slowly dying on its own. It wasn't theoretical. It was a blueprint for disaster painted across the fuselage. And when Zuk saw it, he didn't see paperwork or blame. He saw men who might never come home. And that realization would not let him sleep. Zuk makes a conscious choice. He won't stand by while men die because someone on a drawing board missed the one thing combat demands, redundancy. So, quietly and deliberately, he turns his back on procedure. Under the cover of routine maintenance, he begins a silent, unauthorized revolution, small, practical rewrites to systems that were never meant to be shot at. It's repair work with a purpose, improvisation with consequences. He knows a court-martial could follow. He also knows a patched line could mean a crew returns. Between those two certainties, he chooses to act, one clandestine modification at a time. Zuk becomes a scavenger. Nights find him in the boneyard among skeletons of fortresses, flashlight in one hand, wrench in the other. He harvests valves, hoses, scraps of wiring, anything the manuals don't admit exists. He strips wrecks with a mechanic's tenderness, turning ruined metal into secret lifelines. Each salvaged part is another crew he can save. It started simple and brutal. Zuk cobbled a manually operated backup hydraulic line out of scavenged hoses, valves, and whatever brass fittings he could salvage, routing it so a pilot could reach a single valve with one hand. If the main artery through the bomb bay was sliced open by flak, the aircraft would still die, unless someone could flip that valve. In practice, it meant a pilot who just watched pressure fall to nothing could, in seconds, give the controls a second life. No electronics, no fancy systems, just a human, a wrench, and one small, life-saving twist. Next, he tackles the fuel system. Fuel lines were routed so one hole could starve multiple engines. A single puncture could cascade into engine failures and a powerless bomber. Zuk's solution was brutally simple. Crossover fuel valves. Hand-operated links between tanks that let a pilot isolate a shot tank and draw from a healthy one. Built from salvaged fittings and clearly labeled, the valves turned catastrophic punctures into manageable emergencies and kept engines pumping long enough to get crews home. He doesn't stop there. Zuk rigs a secondary electrical bus, a secret emergency grid tucked into the belly of the fortress. It can feed radios, guns, and vital instruments when the main bus goes dark. Simple, hand-accessible switches let crews flip over in seconds. Hidden from manuals and logs, it becomes another lifeline when everything else has already failed. Zuk isn't just patching leaks or swapping out a valve. He's rewriting the airplane from the ground up with one brutal truth in mind. These machines aren't tested in clean factories. They're shredded in flak and flame. Where Boeing drew lines and ran numbers, Zuk draws loops and backups, rerouting hydraulics, carving out redundancy, and wiring a quiet second life into systems meant to fail the instant metal is torn. He thinks like a survivor, not a theorist, scavenging parts, improvising controls within reach of a panicked pilot, designing fixes that work when everything else has already gone wrong. It's practical, ugly, and necessary engineering for getting shot at. By January 1944, a quiet miracle is happening at Bassingbourn. Planes Zuk had secretly touched stop becoming statistics and start coming home. They limp in on busted tires and nicked wings, fuselages full of daylight, holes you could see the sky through, but they come home. Crews stumble out, knees knocking, and laugh like men who just cheated death. Ground crews wipe soot from their hands and trade knowing looks. Pilots tuck Zuk's scrawled instructions into logbooks like talismans. Word spreads not by order, but by rumor and gratitude. A mechanic's hush-hush fixes are turning impossible flights into safe returns, and for a few precious minutes on the tarmac, fear gives way to relief. By January, the work stopped being a secret and started being a story. 17 B-17s carried Zuk's invisible signature. Ripped fuselages, torn control surfaces, crews who should have been dead, and yet they came walking back across the horizon like ghosts. Pilots began swapping tail numbers in the mess halls. Crew members traced the odd, unofficial routing of valves and hoses and called them the Ghost Fleet in half-joking reverence. Word spread faster than any formal report. If your ship had been touched by that grease-stained mechanic, you stood a chance. Hope, hard and practical, moved through the squadrons. It changed how men climbed into planes the next morning. Tension coiled around Zuk like a wire under pressure. He knew, with a clarity that kept him awake at night, that what he did kept men alive, and that in the eyes of command, it was a punishable crime. Word of his luckier crews spread in whispered thanks between frost-cold runways and dim tool sheds. Pilots grinned and clapped his back. Chiefs winked when he walked by. Still, every improvised valve and secret diagram felt like a live grenade tucked into the belly of the base. Useful, dangerous, and illegal. He fixed planes by day and hid his work by night, always listening for the one boot step that would end it. How long before someone else heard it? February 8th arrives like a verdict. Captain Fletcher, tidy cap, clipboard tucked under his arm, walks the length of Devil's Daughter with the slow, methodical eye of a man who has seen everything. On paper, this is a routine inspection, a box to tick. The bomber's skin is a map of shrapnel and soot. Mechanics hover at a distance, hands clenched, waiting. Fletcher runs his gloved fingers along a seam, listens to the creak of stressed metal, checks serials, notes dates. He expects old repairs and sloppy patches. He does not expect to find anything that should not be there. Then, beneath the hum of the hangar, something makes him stop cold. Deep in the belly of the Devil's Daughter, Fletcher's flashlight caught a sliver of metal that shouldn't be there. A hydraulic bypass, hand-routed like a surgeon's stitch, braided hoses neatly flared, fittings silvered and smoothed as if toyed with by a craftsman instead of a grease monkey. Valves sat within reach of the pilot, their positions marked in careful ink, the whole assembly tucked out of sight but impossibly deliberate. It wasn't a hasty field patch. It was beautiful and utterly unauthorized. Fletcher froze, the inspection checklist falling from his hand. This wasn't a mistake. He needed answers, and he needed them now. They call him up to the office, and the room goes quiet. Fletcher points to the gleaming, unauthorized bypass like a prosecutor presenting evidence. There's no hiding it. The metal runs where no blueprint permits. Zuk stands there, grease under his nails and a steady set to his jaw. He doesn't ham or haw. He says, simply, "I did it. 17 of them." You can feel the air change. Everyone's waiting for the handcuffs, the paperwork, the words court-martial. He expects punishment. He expects the worst. But he also expects the men he saved to be worth whatever comes next, and he says it without theatrics, calm, resigned, and utterly certain. He pauses, hand on the clipboard, the moment of accusation suspended, and instead of ticking a box, he reaches for a stack of coffee-stained after-action reports from the last month, the kind no one wants to read unless they have to. Fletcher flips them open under the humming lights, eyes tracing mission logs, hit locations, system failures, and tail numbers. He's methodical. Scan, note, cross-check. The facts start to line up like breadcrumb marks on a map. What looks like random bad luck begins to feel deliberate, patterned. He keeps pulling reports, laying pages side by side, because somewhere in this dry paper is the reason Zuk's work exists. Fletcher laid the after-action reports out like a grim ledger and let the numbers speak. Dozens of bombers sent home with shredded fuselages, engines knocked out, but the common thread was catastrophic hydraulic failure, lines severed, landing gear and flaps gone, brakes useless, and most of those planes never made it back. Of the dozens catalogued, only 3 limped into English airfields alive. 3 out of many. It was a tiny, impossible survival rate, a statistical anomaly that made Fletcher's mouth go dry and turned routine paperwork into something that demanded answers. Fletcher methodically flips through the after-action pile, tracing tail numbers like a detective following a trail. He ticks off damaged crews, then cross-checks returns. Lucky Strike. Devil's Daughter. 1 more. Each name lands like a stone in his gut. Every survivor on that grim list bears the same seal, Zuk's handiwork. The room narrows. The paperwork suddenly reads like evidence. This isn't coincidence or luck, it's pattern. Unauthorized lines, secret valves, little rebellions under the dirt-streaked cuffs of an enlisted mechanic are the common thread between planes that should have been lost and crews that came home. The math doesn't lie. Cross those tail numbers with the after-action reports, and a damning pattern emerges. The 3 planes that should have been lost, torn open by flak, hydraulics gone, systems dead, were the ones Zuk had secretly altered. This wasn't tinkering for convenience. It was a crude, outlawed lifeline that rewired chance itself and put men back on English soil. Think about that for a second. An unauthorized bypass, handwritten notes, grease-streaked hands, an entire crews spared. Suddenly, this is no longer a disciplinary problem. It's a moral crisis wrapped in a mechanic's wrench. The command had to decide what mattered more, strict rules or living men. Fletcher walks into Colonel Albertson's office with a stack of reports and a silence that says more than any accusation could. He's seen the numbers, traced the tail numbers, and the pattern is brutal and undeniable. Albertson reads, paces, counts the lives that should have been lost and weren't. Now the command is at a crossroads. Do they make an example of a grease-stained mechanic who broke protocol, or do they listen to the man who has quietly been keeping air crews alive? It's a moral and practical dilemma wrapped in uniforms and paperwork, and whatever choice they make will decide whether discipline or survival comes first. When the brass finally decide to look under the hood, they don't send a diplomat or a politician. They send Major Henry Watkins from 8th Air Force Command, clean-cut, clipboard-ready, the kind of man whose life is paperwork and procedure. His orders are simple: find the deviation, name the culprit, close the case. Watkins expects a mess of bodged repairs, a grease-covered rule-breaker who traded safety for shortcuts and now needs punishing. In his mind, he already sees the court-martial. What he doesn't expect is that this small, grimy problem might be the thin, bright line between life and death for hundreds of crews. Major Henry Watkins expected a hack job, a greasy, improvised fix that would confirm every fear about a rogue mechanic playing with life-and-death systems. What he found stopped him cold. Every line was routed with care, every valve mounted straight and labeled, fittings brazed and sealed like a craftsman's pride piece, not a backyard jury rig. These weren't Band-Aids. They were thoughtful solutions aimed squarely at the B-17's combat weak points. Alternate hydraulic runs, deliberate crossovers, isolated feeds. Clever, practical, and quietly elegant. Suspicion gave way to something else on Watkins' face: reluctant respect. He closed the inspection checklist with a very different question than the one he'd come to ask. Watkins' official report lands like a bombshell, clear, impossible to ignore. He doesn't demand a court-martial. He recommends no punishment at all. Instead, he urges something bolder. Take Zuk's unauthorized fixes out of the shadows and put them to the ultimate test: instant, real-world combat trials. It's a shocking reversal. The grease-stained mechanic who broke procedure is suddenly the most promising path to keeping crews alive. Watkins frames it not as defiance, but as evidence-based urgency. Prove the mods under fire and fast. That recommendation propels the paper trail upward, and with it, outsiders from headquarters and industry are about to arrive. The paper trail climbs the ladder fast. Watkins' bombshell recommendation moves from squadron to wing to headquarters, each signature a small drumbeat of consequence, until finally it lands on the desk of Boeing's liaison. They call him in from Seattle. He's not a colonel or a pilot. He's an engineer named Carlson, the kind of man who trusts blueprints more than gut, who thinks problems are solved with diagrams and tests, not grease and improvisation. He packs the company's certainty with him, and when he arrives at Bassingbourn, his presence promises a collision between theory and the gritty reality that Zuk has been quietly rewriting. From Seattle he comes, Carlson, all buttoned collar and clean blueprints, stepping into the oily world of Bassingbourn like a judge entering a tavern. He stops at Zuk's bomber, palms behind his back, head tilted, eyes scanning the improvised plumbing with that particular look of a man who trusts calculations more than combat. Around him, mechanics fall silent. The hangar smells of gasoline and hot metal, and Carlson's contempt hangs in the air as openly as his tie. He looks every inch the authority from headquarters. Clinical, precise, untouchable. Then finally reaches out and points at the bypass lines, ready to pronounce them wrong. Carlson jabbed a finger at the tangle of metal and rubber like a professor grading a failed thesis, voice sharp with authority. He laid out the lecture. Bypasses, backflows, unintended pressure differentials, technical words meant to make the hack look dangerous. "It can't possibly work," he snapped to Major Watkins. "It violates fundamental principles of hydraulic engineering." The tone was not curiosity. It was contempt. Watkins listened, clipboard forgotten. In the doorway, grease-stained and quiet, Paul Zuk let the reprimand wash over him. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He simply waited for the evidence to speak.
Zuk stands there, grease on his coveralls, oil under his nails, calm as a man who spent his life wrestling with metal, listening. The Boeing engineer lectures in clipped, certain sentences, pointing at blueprints like scripture, explaining why the bypass can't work. Around them the hangar hums, men, tools, the low ache of planes that have seen too much. Zuk doesn't argue. He doesn't raise his voice. He lets the pristine suit finish, lets the theories fall into the open air, cataloging every confident claim with the quiet patience of someone who's watched theory die under flak. Then he waits. Then Zuk asks a simple, disarming question. "Sir, when's the last time you flew a combat mission?" It lands like a thrown stone. The room goes quiet. Carlson, pristine and practiced in theory, visibly tightens. Zuk isn't shouting. He's not trying to humiliate. His voice is flat, almost casual, but the implication is lethal. Design on a drawing board versus design under fire. For a beat, the debate about valves and flow rates collapses into one blunt fact. Somebody who'd actually flown these planes would know what a mid-air nightmare feels like. Carlson bristles, caught off guard, and with a tight, clipped edge in his voice, snaps, "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." It's a brittle little shield, credentials and diagrams wrapped around a single dismissal, and he lets it hang in the air as if that settles the matter. He straightens, adjusts an immaculate cuff, and leans on theory like a crutch, while the mechanics around him go silent, waiting to see if hands-on experience or clean calculations will carry the day. Zuk nods, then delivers the line like a verdict. Calm, plain, inevitable. "Right. You designed this system in Seattle, where the worst thing that happens is a failed pressure test. I fix it when it comes back with holes in it. It's a different perspective." The room goes still. Carlson's confident posture falters. His neat tie suddenly looks fragile next to Zuk's grease-streaked sleeves. It's not an insult so much as a map of two worlds colliding, blueprint theory versus mud and blood experience, and for a heartbeat, everyone understands who has actually been listening to the planes come home. The air in the briefing room turned electric. What started as a lecture about principles had become a fight over human lives, pilot skill against drawing board certainty. Major Watkins pushed his recommendation forward. Test Zuk's fixes in combat, under real fire. It was radical, risky, and formally improper. Still, when the men who knew what was at stake spoke loudest, command swallowed its pride and gave the green light for a live combat trial. The test was radical. Mechanics and engineers crawled through the belly of each fortress, bolting tiny wartime spies to hydraulic lines, fuel manifolds, and the electrical bus. Instruments meant to watch every heartbeat of the plane. These sensors streamed pressure, voltage, and failure events back to Bassingbourn in real time. It felt like clandestine science, desperate, impatient, and utterly necessary to prove whether Zuk's fixes would survive combat. From March 5th to the 18th, 5 of Zuk's handiwork roll out,
fitted with sensors and sent on the deadliest runs straight into the heart of Germany. Heavy flak, prowling fighters, and vital factories as targets. Pilots tighten straps. Mechanics hold their breath. These are not test hops. This is real combat. The moment the secret fixes must either save lives or be exposed in blood. The test flights left at dawn, loaded, nervous, and sent into hell on purpose. By the time they staggered back, 3 of the 5 had been brutally mauled by flak and fighters, ripped, smoking, patched together by sheer luck and skill. Yet every one of them limped into Bassingbourn. Crews climbed out stunned, mechanics exchanged incredulous looks, and the raw mission data they'd brought home promised to rewrite what everyone thought possible. On a cold morning over Friedrichshafen, everything comes to a head. Memphis Belle 2, one of the planes quietly modified by Zuk, rips into a wall of flak. Shrapnel fries the skin. Turrets rattle. The crew braces at their stations. Instruments flicker and alarms stutter. For a dozen seconds the sky feels like fire, and whether this bomber survives will be decided in the next heartbeat. The plane shudders violently, an ear-splitting blast as a shell detonates under the bomb bay. Shrapnel tears through skin and metal, rending cable bundles and spraying hydraulic lines with fire and smoke. Lights wink out. Alarms begin to scream. Hands go reflexively to circuit breakers. Somewhere beneath their boots, the main hydraulic artery has been punctured and pressure begins to bleed away. Back at Bassingbourn, a handful of technicians crowd around a bank of dials and plotting paper, eyes glued to the flickering screens. Every beep suddenly feels loud. The telemetry scrolls across in real time, altitude, RPM, fuel flow. Then the primary hydraulic pressure trace just peels off the bottom of the graph. It dives, fast, a collective intake of breath. Someone curses under his breath. Fingers hover over switches that can't help from here. For a moment, the room holds itself, watching a line fall like a cliff on a chart, and everyone knows that on the other end of that drop is disaster. On the screens, the line doesn't just fall, it disappears. 4.2 seconds from healthy pressure to absolute zero. In the room, the telemetry team goes quiet like they've watched a heart flatline. Someone swears softly. Someone else stares at the numbers as if they could will them back. Zero hydraulic pressure on a B-17 isn't a warning, it's a verdict. No gear, no flaps, no brakes, crippled control surfaces. A bomber reduced to gliding metal with no way to stop. It's a textbook death sentence, spelled out in bright, indifferent telemetry. And yet, miles ahead, men in that very cockpit are still making decisions. In the cockpit of Memphis Belle 2, there's a strange, steady calm. Not the panic you'd expect when instruments drop to zero. The pilot unfolds the simple, handwritten instructions Zuk had personally given him, breathes once, and follows them without fanfare. No shouting, no hesitation. Just one crewman putting his trust in a grease-stained stranger's lifeline. He reaches down and, steady-handed, turns 3 manual valves tucked beside his seat. One, then another, then the third. Exactly as Zuk's handwritten note had instructed. Each twist feels final. A click, a soft hiss, a tiny shudder through the controls. For a beat he waits, yoke gripped, then lets out a slow breath as the backup system comes alive. Back at the base, technicians hunched over glowing scopes watch a hairline trace suddenly jump. The primary pressure collapses. Then the backup line roars to life. Gauges climb. The secondary system steadies. Alarms quiet. In that instant, the numbers stop lying. The rigged valves bought the crew time. Down in the bomber, the pilot relaxes his grip and keeps the formation. Against all odds, the crippled bomber holds formation. Rocking, patched, leaking, but steady. The crew steels themselves as flak rattles the fuselage and engines cough.
The pilot keeps his eyes on the lead, trusting the makeshift system he just switched on. They press on to the target, release their bombs into a sky still full of danger, then turn for home. Every heartbeat a small, stubborn victory. Hours later, Memphis Belle 2 thumped down at Bassingbourn and rolled to a shaky stop. Tires screaming, metal groaning. Then came the long, staggering silence of people who just cheated death. The crew climbed out slowly, faces smudged, clothes torn, hands finding each other in relief and disbelief. Ground crews swarmed with stretchers and coffee, but inside the operations block, technicians were already replaying the flight data that would turn relief into a very different kind of astonishment. In the debriefing room, Carlson sits rigid, eyes fixed on the playback as if the screen might lie. The telemetry trace tumbles, a clean, terrifying fall from steady pressure to absolute zero in a heartbeat, the sort of signature that meant a bomber was finished. Silence hangs. Then, abruptly, a second line spikes back to life, a crude rise, not elegant but effective, the backup system snapping the hydraulic world back into being. Carlson's jaw tightens. The meters show what his models said was impossible. On the screen, theory dies, and reality stubbornly refuses to. And for the first time he has to admit he doesn't understand why it worked. He stares at the playback, and for a long, heavy beat there's nothing but the hum of the projector and the soft tap of instruments on the console. Then the numbers hit him like a fist. The graph falls to zero, the primary line flatlines, and 4 seconds later another line spikes back to life. It's clinical, cold, and utterly indisputable. The data does not care for pride, or theory, or design manuals. By every equation in his head, the bomber should have disintegrated over Germany. Instead, it's out there on the tarmac, whole enough to taxi, its crew alive. Carlson's mouth goes dry. He has no ready answer, only a growing, impossible doubt. Carlson turned to Major Watkins, and for the first time his posture folded in on itself, the clean certainty of the designer replaced by something quieter, almost stunned. He swallowed, looked at the glowing telemetry, and let the words out in a voice that had lost its edge. This shouldn't work. It wasn't bravado. It was a professional confession. The math and charts he'd trusted now lay contradicted by cold, humming data and a battered bomber sitting on the field. Around him, the room tightened. Engineers and airmen alike felt the fragile line between theory and survival snap, and waited for an answer that no blueprint could give. On the screen, the numbers don't lie, but they don't make sense either. Pressure curves dropping to nothing, flow rates that should mean instant failure, telemetry screaming black where there should be life. Carlson scrolls through graphs, pencils frantic margins, and then, quietly, almost to himself, the pressure dynamics, the flow rates, they're all wrong according to our models. But it does work. I don't understand why. His professional confidence fractures. The neat equations he trusted can't account for a bomber that should be a wreck, but is parked outside, its crew alive. He looks up at Zuk, searching not for a technical loophole, but for the human logic that somehow beat the math. From the back of the room, Zuk speaks. Plain, matter-of-fact, like a man who's seen too many boys ride a bad design to its end. He doesn't quote theories or equations. He talks about holes in aluminum, about pilots who learn by luck or by dying, about fixes that don't look elegant on a drawing board but work when the sky is full of flak. It's the kind of answer corporate reports won't print, not about ideal flow rates, but about worst-case thinking and redundancy you can reach with dirty hands at 2 a.m. The room goes quiet. From the back of the room, Zuk's voice cuts through the technical chatter. Simple, flat, impossible to argue with. It works because I designed it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great on paper, until it doesn't.
He means that engineers in Seattle design for ideal tests and neat diagrams. Zuk designs for holes the size of fists, for hydraulic lines chewed open by flak, for crews with seconds to act. His fixes weren't elegant theory. They were brute, redundant, reachable by a sweating pilot with blood on his hands. Manual valves, crossover lines, a second electrical bus. Not pretty. Absolutely effective. The test data left no room for doubt.
Telemetry showed the primary line collapse to 0, and then, against every model and expectation, spike back to life the moment a crew reached down and opened Zuk's valves. Engineers watched the playback in stunned silence. Command watched the numbers, and then watched procedure. Lawyers, liability, endless meetings that moved at the slow, safe pace of paperwork. Zuk stood there with grease on his hands and a quiet, impatient pride, knowing he'd proven the impossible, and also knowing that proving it on a screen wouldn't instantly cut through the red tape that keeps habits alive long after facts change. While the Pentagon debated and Boeing negotiated liability, the mechanics of the 8th Air Force stopped waiting for permission. In shadowed hangars and muddy aprons, crew chiefs traded quick sketches and whispered instructions. Grease-stained hands slipped in bypasses, rewired valves, and bolted on crossover lines between missions, often under the cover of night. It was unofficial, often illegal, and utterly practical. They chose action over paperwork, and slowly, quietly, those altered planes started coming home. Zuk's designs were sketched on scraps of paper and shoved into grease-stained pockets. Simple diagrams, a valve here, a bypass there, and then passed from crew chief to crew chief like contraband. Word traveled by rumor and handshake, a trick that kept a bomber from dying. Men copied the drawings in dim huts, scavenged fittings from wrecks, and stayed up through blackouts installing the fixes under tarps and flashlights. It spread fast. Bases whispered to bases. Pilots memorized 3 little valves. Mechanics trusted what worked, not what a desk said. In a war of paperwork, practical wisdom became gospel. At the 100th Bomb Group, known grimly as the Bloody 100th, the sketches stopped being sketches and become work. In the dead hours, under the sweep of a single hanging bulb, grease-streaked mechanics pry panels, splice hoses, and bend metal into solutions that weren't supposed to exist. They whisper instructions instead of filing reports. They sneak replacement valves into toolboxes, bolt bypass lines where officers never look, and teach one another with quick, blunt demonstrations between missions. It's illegal. It's risky. But after the losses they've seen, waiting for permission feels like signing men's names to graves. So they choose to save them instead. What started as one man's quiet defiance quickly became a grassroots engineering revolution. Grease-streaked crew chiefs and tired mechanics in dozens of dark hangars choosing to bend rules because men lived in the balance, not paperwork. They worked between missions, under blackout lights, swapping scavenged valves and hand-drawn schematics, teaching pilots simple emergency moves over a beer or a cigarette break. It was illegal, yes, but it was moral. A silent pledge passed from wrench to wrench. Get the boys home. Word spread faster than any order from command. One base to the next, one flight line to another, until the modifications were no longer secret, but survival. The results were immediate and dramatic. At the 379th Bomb Group, aborts because of mechanical failure plummeted from 14% down to just 6%, and that kind of drop changed everything. More aircraft punched through to the target, fewer crews turned back by a failing pump or a burst line, and squadron commanders suddenly had sorties to plan instead of funerals to call. Ground crews walked a little taller, pilots began filing grateful, bewildered reports. It didn't just shave percentages off a ledger, it kept missions alive and men alive. And those early, unmistakable gains were the proof mechanics needed to spread the fixes further. The proof was blunt and brutal. Across the 8th Air Force, those lightly bloodied B-17s that had Zuk's touches were now 3 times more likely to limp home than their unmodified sisters. 3 times. Holes you could see the sky through, engines coughing and flaps half gone, and still crews were climbing out instead of being carried out. Mechanics who'd worked all night in oil and sweat began to feel something they hadn't in months: quiet confidence. Mission after mission, the numbers stacked up. Aborts fell, crews stayed intact, and the raw arithmetic of survival made the problem impossible to ignore by anyone who cared about keeping men alive. Finally, in April 1944, after months of quiet revolt and impossible telemetry, the brass could no longer look the other way. Technical Order 01-20EF-188 was issued, an official stamp authorizing the hydraulic bypass that Paul Zuk had been wiring in shadows and on scraps. It was a victory, plain and simple. What had been illegal, homegrown tinkering became sanctioned doctrine overnight. Mechanics breathed easier. Pilots clicked on manual valves with an extra measure of hope. Yet even as cheers rippled through the hangars, the order was narrow. It legitimized the bypass, but it did not and would not fully embrace the rest of Zuk's hard-won fixes. On paper, it looked like a win, an official technical order authorizing Zuk's hydraulic bypass. But it was a half measure, a bureaucratic compromise that left the war's nastiest failure modes untouched. The new directive codified the one fix the brass could stomach and quietly ignored Zuk's equally critical solutions for fuel crossovers and emergency electrical buses, the very things that prevented engines from dying mid-flight or instruments from going dark after a single hit. Liability, pride, and textbook engineering smoothed the paperwork. Reality on the flight line didn't change. For crews who watched planes come back missing skin and systems, that order was not enough. The order from on high was a compromise. It wasn't enough. So in the dim roar of night at Bassingbourn and other fields, crew chiefs and grease-stained mechanics kept doing what the Pentagon refused to fully sanction. They worked by flashlight and habit, fitting crossover valves, wiring emergency buses, routing hoses where the manuals never permitted. They copied Zuk's sketches onto cigarette packs and scrap paper and taught pilots the 3 simple levers to pull when the main system bled out. It was illegal. It was risky. But for them, the choice was stark: follow a half measure or do whatever it took to get the crews home. They chose the crews. After the war, Captain Dorothy Henshaw, an Army officer with a knack for numbers and a stack of dusty maintenance logs, sat down to do what no one in wartime command had bothered to do: actually measure the cost of design versus the value of field fixes. She cross-checked mission reports, repair sheets, and tail numbers until a pattern emerged so stark it felt like a punch to the gut. Planes touched by those makeshift bypasses and crossover valves were coming home at dramatically higher rates. The discovery was simple and terrible all at once. These clandestine, unauthorized tweaks hadn't just kept metal flying, they had kept men alive. The data didn't lie. Bomb groups that adopted Zuk's full package of modifications saw a 23.4% increase in aircraft returning from missions. Put another way, those jury-rigged valves, crossover fuel lines, and secret emergency circuits translated into roughly 3,000 to 4,000 airmen walking back across RAF tarmacs instead of staying in German soil. That's whole crews spared, entire squadrons preserved, families who received letters instead of telegrams. In a war counted in sorties and tonnage, Zuk's true metric was human. Lives returned. It was a staggering, literal return on ingenuity, and yet the man himself would remain largely unrecognized. And what of the man himself? Paul Zuk left the Army as a technical sergeant. No medal, no formal recognition, no mention in his file of the thousands he made possible. Imagine that: a handful of grease-stained notebooks, a rank patch, and a quiet discharge.
while entire crews kept flying because of parts he jury-rigged in the dark.
The math of survival was written in his shop, not in generals' reports. He walked away with pay and a commendation nowhere to be found. His work folded into policy, but his name left off the roster of heroes. History forgot him, but not the men who came home. While Paul Zuk left the Army with no medal and no official credit, the machines he secretly saved didn't forget. Industry did. Boeing, mostly behind closed doors, folded the very idea of redundancy he'd hacked into the B-17 into the design logic of the next-generation bombers like the B-29. Extra valves, alternate feed paths, layered electrical buses. The practical, unglamorous stuff that keeps men alive. In other words, his patchwork became policy. His grease-stained solutions became engineering doctrine. The planes got safer. The company moved on. Zuk's name did not. His genius became standard practice, anonymous but everywhere.
Paul Zuk died in 1989, leaving behind dog-eared notebooks full of pragmatic fixes and hand-drawn diagrams, the kind of messy genius that saved lives but never made headlines. He walked away as a technical sergeant, no medals, no official thanks, yet his unauthorized solutions quietly reshaped bomber survival and seeped into later designs like the B-29. What began as grease-stained improvisation became standard practice, a stubborn lesson that field experience can outpace theory. His story is a reminder. Sometimes the most important orders are the ones you write yourself when lives are on the line. Who else has been forgotten by history? Tell us in the comments.